2 Samuel, we're going to back up a little bit into chapter 3, just kind of review what we talked about there, and then go into 4, 5, and 6. We're going to also do some cross-referencing tonight because there are two books that record, once we get into David's kingship and Solomon and some of the other kings of Judah, there are two places that these accounts are given. Here in 2 Samuel and then in 1 Kings, but also over in the book of 1 Chronicles. And so we're going to look at some in 1 Chronicles tonight, especially when we get into chapter 6 of 2 Samuel, and David begins to bring the ark back in. We're also going to jump back into Numbers and look at a couple of things when we get into chapter 6 also. So you'll remember in chapter 3 that there was war between the house of Saul and David. Abner had put Ishbosheth up as the king, and it happened probably about 2 years or so after Saul had died. He'd been kind of really local and started to expand, began to have conflict with David, and for about 5.5 years there was conflict with David. And then David now is living in Hebron, and he's got 5 or 6 kids. He has Amnon, son of Ahinoam, and we already heard about Ahinoam because when David took Abigail as his wife, who was had formerly been the wife of Nabal, it says that he already had taken Ahinoam. Now, we all remember, too, that before either of those two, David had Michal, who was his wife. And it's interesting that she's not mentioned in these 6. You'll remember that he had to leave her to run for his life. But there is some indication that she may have been mentioned, and I'll show that to you when we get over into, I think, chapter 5 or 6. So anyway, we've got 6 sons that are born to him here. 3 of them we never hear anything else about. 3 of them we hear about later, but it's not good stuff that we hear. And so we will talk about those when we get to them. Now, Abner has been strengthening his own position, and he has been involved with the concubine of Saul. Her name was Rizpah. And he was trying to strengthen his own position because you'll remember I shared with you last week that the wives of the king, once the king died and a new king steps into the position, all those wives are legally the wives of the new king. And so even though Ishbosheth was probably quite a lot younger than Rizpah, she was his wife. And so when Abner had slept with her, and then Ishbosheth found out about it, and he called Abner to task about it, and probably wasn't the wisest thing Ishbosheth ever did, because he was only in power because of Abner. And Abner got very angry at him and said, I'm done with you. And he said, I'm going to turn the kingdom over to David. It was at that point that we realized that Abner, all these 7.5 years, Abner has been going contrary to what he knew God, the God of Israel, wanted and expected. He knew that God wanted David to be the king, and yet he was still trying to push his own agenda because it suited him. And so he made contact with David, and when he contacted David, David listened to him. David had a really open kind of a personality, which is one of the reasons why I think people like him. And he was willing to take Abner in and say, well, sure, listen, if you want to swear allegiance to me, I'll take you in. And so he set things up, and he said, listen, I got to have my wife back, Michal. And so I explained to you last week how that was really critical because of the fact that she was the daughter of the former king. And not only did the wives of the former king provide like a path to the kingship, but the children did also, particularly the daughters. So David needed to have her back so that nobody else would have a claim to the throne. And so he goes back and he tells Ishbosheth, and David ends up sending a message. And so they go and they take Michal away from Paltiel, her husband. She had been with him probably 15 years, give or take a little. And he came behind her weeping until Abner yelled at him and told him to go home. And so the poor guy goes home. And I can't help but feel sorry for this guy. He had taken care of this woman. Now, it doesn't say anything to us about what Michal felt about all this. There's no indication as to her feelings. But now she's back and she's the wife of the king. Well, Joab comes back just after Abner leaves. And Joab finds that David has talked to Abner. and he is really ticked because, after all, Abner had killed his brother Asahel, had run that spear through his belly, and he was out for blood. And so he gets very angry at David, leaves David's presence, and goes after Joab, calls him back, or Abner. And Abner comes back thinking that there's a message about this new step in Abner's life, and he kills him in a public place. Stabs him in the stomach, painful way to die, but he did it because that's what Abner did to his brother. And so as we leave this situation, we remember there was a lot of weeping and stuff, and David made Joab walk in front of the casket, if you will, that was carrying Abner, and he had to mourn, had to be dressed in mourning clothes, and that was probably humiliating to Joab, but it never really stopped him. And you'll notice I did point out to you a verse that's really important about David. In chapter 3, verse 36, it says, "All the people took note of how David conducted himself after Abner had been killed, and they were pleased. Indeed, everything the king did pleased them." David expresses a little frustration there about Joab and Abishai and how they're so strong-willed. But in the long run, Joab is good for David. And he's beneficial, and we'll look at that when we get a little bit further into this. Now, Ishbosheth is still around. Even though his general is gone, Abner is dead, now Ishbosheth is still around. And so he's been going on with his life as life goes on. And he had guys who were captains of units, and they would often, when they were paid, they would get paid by foodstuffs like grain or corn or something. And so they would come on a regular basis into Ishbosheth's palace, and he would make sure that they had the grain that they could take out to their fighting men. And so one day, there are these two guys who were leaders of raiding bands. Their names were Baana and Rechab. And one day, it says that they came to visit. Now, there's a mention here of a guy that we don't even find out about him until a little bit later. There's just a little tiny mention here of a guy named Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan. And on the day when Jonathan and Saul and the others went to battle, Mephibosheth was about 5 years old. And I find this, and every time I go through this story, I find this interesting. But the day when they heard that Jonathan, his dad, was dead, his nurse picked him up to carry him. And as she was, now I'm thinking to myself, why is she carrying a 5-year-old boy? A 5-year-old boy? How old is Wyatt? 6. He's 6. Okay, back him off a year. If you were running, would you pick him up and carry him, or would you say, grab my hand, let's run? I don't understand it. I don't know if he was small for his age. But as they're fleeing, maybe she, I'm not even sure why they had to flee. Maybe they thought the Philistines were coming actually to the place where they lived, and they were going to try to kill all of them too. But at any rate, it says they were fleeing, and she was in a hurry, and she dropped him. And I must have crippled a leg or something. And so as a result of that, now Mephibosheth has grown, and by this time, Mephibosheth, if he was 5 then, that's been at least 7.5 years. And so as we're moving toward, he's probably 13 years old at this point in time. And so they just mention him, and then we'll find out more about him later. So it's just, I find it kind of interesting. They just kind of slid it in there. Oh, by the way, Jonathan, his best friend, David's best friend, had a son. And so now these two guys, the two leaders of these raiding bands, they went to the house of Ishbosheth. And they get there probably a little earlier than what they were meant to get there. During those days and times when it was hot, they didn't have air conditioning. You know, we got air conditioning. We shut the windows, crank the air up, everything cools down, we can be productive. What if it were 80 or 90 degrees and you couldn't get the air conditioning on? And at the hottest part of the day, what happens when you get hot? You want to drift off. Well, the best thing that they would do, you know, and they do this even in some Latin American countries today, they take their siesta midpoint of the day because it's so hot. They really can't get a lot done. And this is what Ishbosheth was doing. So these guys arrive at this point in the day, and they go into the inner part of the house as if to get wheat, like they were going to take some to pay their men. And they stab Ishbosheth in the stomach. And then they leave. Now, they thought, you see, in those days, the Arab-type chieftains, they would bring great reward if someone were to kill their opponent, their adversary, and prove it by, I mean, you know, it's not like today's society. You see these movies, you know, and they'll take a snapshot of, you know, the assassins. They take a snapshot, or it's on the news that somebody was killed. That's their proof. They didn't have that in those days. So the only way they could prove that they'd really killed Ishbosheth is to cut the guy's head off. And so they cut his head off, and they probably put it in a bag or something. And so they travel to meet David. And so they slip away, and they travel all night by way of the Arabah, and that's kind of like a desert area. And they bring the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron. Here's the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to kill you. They're so mixed up. And they so don't understand David's view of leadership. This day the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his offspring. Well, now, these guys, can you imagine if you thought, I just heard, I don't know, where was the guy? Some guy somewhere won $1 million, and they just delivered his check today. And he took the cash option, so it was only like $563,000 or whatever. That'd be a nice check to be dropped off, you know? But imagine if you think you're going to the bank to cash in a lottery winning, and instead of cashing in the lottery winning, when you present what you think is the winning ticket, all of a sudden alarms go off and guards jump out from the walls and they grab you and they take you off and you're executed instead. That's what happened to these guys. They thought they were going to strike it rich. They thought, man, we've hit the lottery. We're going to cash in here because David, he's king. He's got money. This is his enemy. Let's take him his head. He'll reward us. Well, look what happens. We've seen this kind of thing before, so I think you kind of know what's coming. David says to these guys, listen, surely as God lives, who delivered me, somebody else came to me and said, Saul's dead. And he thought he was bringing good news. I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag. That's the reward I gave him for his news. Now, about this time, can you imagine their hearts are beginning to sink? You know, and they're seeing David's men, and the guys are kind of moving to surround them. And their hands are on their swords. Because they know David. And so they've got these guys ringed so they can't get away. And David continues, how much more when wicked men, and all of a sudden those words fall on their ears, have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed, should I not now demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you? David orders his men, and the guys that had surrounded them already, their swords are out, and they're down, they're gone. They take the head of Ishbosheth, however, and they bury it in the most honorable place that they've got, which is Abner's tomb there at Hebron. And so again, this is one of those things where David is making the right choices. And once David became king, in most situations, there's a couple of them where it's a little questionable. We're going to hit them tonight, one of them anyway. But most of the time, David makes really, really wise choices. Well, now at this point, Israel has got no king. This is the rest of the tribes. Judah has already accepted David. Now, the difference between Judah and Israel, Judah accepted David as king because David was their family. He was of that tribe. His tribe was part of Judah. And Judah was, by the way, Judah was the largest tribe. If you look back into the book of Numbers, and I just read through Numbers this last week, but when you look back through Numbers, there's different times when they count the different tribes as they're moving along and they're wandering in the wilderness. And Judah is definitely the largest tribe. And so Judah has made David king already, but the rest of the tribes have not. And so now the rest of the tribes come to David at Hebron. Look what they say. We are your flesh and blood. You're an Israelite. We're an Israelite. In the past, when Saul was king, you were the one who led Israel in our military campaigns. They're remembering. See, I told you all along, they never forgot this. Those men that were tracking David down in the wilderness were the guys he had led in war. And they respected David. They appreciated his valor and the blessing and the anointing of God that was on him. And so they're mentioning it here. You were the one that led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler. And so the elders of Israel came to David, and the king makes a covenant with them. So this is like now covenants in those days were a lot more intense than what our agreements are today. It was much more intense than a contract. But if you can think of it as a contract on steroids with consequences if you break the covenant, you break the contract, that's what David, he made an agreement with these people. But I noticed something that's really interesting to me. And because I know where we're going, I know where this is going to end up. I find it really interesting when I see little indications of what's going to come. And I see something here that just stands out to me. They say, the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler. They knew this the whole time they were following Ishbosheth. They knew this the whole time they were following Abner as he led them. And they didn't move during that 7 years to make David their king. Even though Judah had, and they knew it, they were content to be apart from what God's plan was. Can you see that? They said, we know that God said, you're going to become the ruler. And yet, they had no hurry. They were just kind of doing their own thing. They were being led by Abner, being led by Ishbosheth. And to me, it shows a weakness in the character of the people of Israel, that once we get through David's reign, we get through Solomon's reign, and then we get to the beginning of his son's reign, Israel and Judah separate. And when Israel becomes a separate entity, they never have a godly king from then until they're taken into captivity. They are always being led by the wrong people, and it's a mess. And they end up going into captivity, I think, about 250 to 280 years or so before Judah. Now, Judah had their problems, but they were more spiritually minded than Israel. And it just kind of shows up here in their willingness. They're coming along and saying, okay, David, we're going to make you our king now, but we've known for a while you were supposed to be our king, but we didn't do anything about it. And it just says to me, this is kind of the character of the people of Israel. And so anyway, they make a covenant and they anoint David king over Israel. And it says David is 30 years old when he became king, and he reigns for 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. So now we come to something that I find fascinating, and that's, when did Jerusalem actually become the capital of Israel? And this is where it happens, right here. Jerusalem was occupied by a group of people called the Jebusites. And Jerusalem is a very well-protected fortress. If you've ever seen pictures, you know that there are places where the city has got just like rock walls that kind of lead up to it. And so David has his eyes on Jerusalem, which was in the center of his territory. It was in the center of where Israel and Judah and all of them were supposed to live, but they hadn't captured it yet. Now you remember that God had told them, you need to go in and just wipe out the Canaanites. Don't spare any of them. Go in, wipe them out, and that's your land. They hadn't done it yet. And so in the past, now, if you look back into, I think it was the book of Joshua, one of the tribes had conquered part of Jerusalem, but they had not been able to keep it. And they had, from that time, they had been kind of pushed out. And now David is casting his eyes on that and says, you know what? That needs to be my capital city. But the problem was, the Jebusites were so confident that nobody could get in, that they even had a saying, which, and it doesn't seem to make sense when you read it. They said, you can't get in here, even the blind and the lame can ward you off. What they mean by that is that this fortress is so well protected that we could put blind and lame people at all of the entrances and you still couldn't get in. That's what they're saying. And so they're kind of bragging. Wrong thing to do to David. Wrong thing to do. So they kind of sent this word out. They sent the message. You're not going to get in here. Now, we could put blind and lame people at all the exits and all the places to get in, and you're not going to get in. Now, let's see. I don't know if it's here or if it's in 1 Chronicles, but what David says is, and I'm looking, it's not here. Oh, there it is. Verse 8. Anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. So, from what I've been able to piece together and understand, I'm not sure if I read this from Adam Clark or somebody else, but there was a well in the center of the city that went down, and there was a passageway that went all the way out to a spring just outside the city wall. And this passageway was used so that if there were ever an attack, an enemy army laid siege on Jerusalem, that people could go down that well and down that passage, and they could get the water from that spring and bring it back into the city, and the city would still have water, which was an issue when an enemy army would come and surround them and build siege works and everything so that they could try to conquer the city. One of the things they did was they would cut them off from the food on the outside of the city and even water. And so this shaft went down through the center, and it ran along a passageway to the spring. And so David is saying, if you are going to conquer, you're going to have to go in through the shaft and up into the center of the city. And it's kind of like, if you can imagine you're familiar, I think most of you would be familiar with the Trojan horse. How people got into the city and then from the inside of the city opened the gates so that the attack could take place. Same kind of idea here. Joab, and I don't know if it was just Joab or Joab and some of his men, went through that tunnel, and I don't have any details as to whether it was a steep incline and they can only go one or two at a time, or whether it was a passageway they could walk through. But whatever happened, Joab got through, and there's a reference, I think maybe it's in Chronicles, where it makes a comment that whoever conquers this city will be my general. And Joab is the one that does it. And he gets through there, and I don't know if he was sneaking through the city. We don't know a lot of details, just that there was some kind of a water shaft, and that they used that to get into the city, and then they were able to open the doors, and David's army was able to get in. And so David conquers at least part of the city here, and takes up residence in the fortress, and that's kind of what he called Jerusalem, and begins to build the area up. And so that happened right at the beginning of his time as king of all of Israel. And so he began to reign from Jerusalem, and it's at that point, from then until eternity future, Jerusalem has always been special in the eyes of God, and to the point that heaven, the city of heaven, is called the New Jerusalem. But right here is when Jerusalem came into focus and into possession of the people of Israel. And so David is being blessed by God, and he's getting friends in high places. The king of Tyre begins to send him what he needs to build a palace. I'd love to be able to see what that palace looked like. It had to be pretty special. And I think I've used up my... Oh, no, good. I need to stop this and